No, data can never be objective. I don't think so. And anybody who is doing quantitative work and is insisting that the numbers are objective, I think should be taken with a grain of salt.
This is Southeast Asia from the ground up. I'm your host, Amir. I'm here with Dr. Sana Jaffrey. Hi, Sana.
Hi, Amir.
How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Dr. Sana Jaffrey is a research fellow at the Department of Political and Social Change at ANU, and I'm quite excited to talk to you about data today, just making sense what is data and how should we think about it, especially you have quite long experience with both qualitative and quantitative data. You manage a World Bank project in Jakarta, uh, doing this National Violence Monitoring System data project, right? So just curious to perhaps we can start there. We can start at how you get into Southeast Asia and start, getting into this project in Indonesia.
Thank you, Amir. So I came to Southeast Asia by accident. Actually, I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and around 2008, there was a call for somebody to help manage a data project at the World Bank in Indonesia. And they were looking for somebody very junior. They were looking for somebody with some data experience, and I applied. And it was supposed to be a 6 month job, actually, short term engagement. It ended up being 5 years.
Yes.
So I worked for 5 years, based out of Jakarta, constructing the National Violence Monitoring Project at the World Bank, which was basically designed to help the government of Indonesia assess the impact of their conflict management policies.
Yes, and obviously, even after 2013, you still use that data and make sense of that data and publish qualitative analysis and writing from the data. One of my favorite essays is Justice by Number that you wrote for New Mandala that I thought laid out, the usefulness of that data set quite well. But as someone who works with both methods, right, this quantitative and qualitative method, how do you make sense of useful data from the field?
There are different ways of making use of quantitative data. One is obviously to look at the numbers themselves, which I do in my work quite a bit of. Most of my experience is in event data, which means we have each data point represents a particular event, and then it has different qualities about that event. So, for example, if an event was a demonstration, how many people participated, if there were any people who were hurt during that demonstration, where did that demonstration took place or location, etc. So a database, an events database, can have these kinds of information in it. It's a table, right? So you obviously that's useful in terms of looking at aggregate numbers, in terms of looking at where the violence is happening, what type of violence is happening, what are the impacts in terms of which types of violence are more deadly. So those things are, I think, we do, and it's quite common to look at those kinds of numbers. But one of the other ways in which I found the quantitative data to be very, very useful is the process of the data generation itself, and the subjective process that it is, that can improve our understanding of how violence is happening and how people are perceiving particular kinds of violence. So that's another.
And I would really like to unpack that a little bit further later. But before that, one of the interesting things related to the usefulness of data is pointing to gaps in the analysis, in the scholarly analysis, right? In your essay, for example, Justice by Number, you pointed out several scholarly, these puzzling gaps. For example, some scholars theorize or hypothesize that, well, after reformacy, with adjustment to decentralized Indonesia, violence should reduce. In fact, your data show that it increased, and the other gaps that you or trends that you pointed out was how crime should be quite low in highly concentrated state presence, like in Sumatra and Java. But in fact, it's not. It's not, right. There's quite a lot of crimes in that, and it tied to this history of authoritarian Indonesia and its civilian militias, right? But with that, especially in the second trend, you do need to have this qualitative understanding of civilian militias to offer the answer of how and why, right? So is that how you think about data necessarily? Like, well, quantitative data is good for what question, and qualitative data is good for how and why. How do you fit this two together? Are they complementary?
I think the way that I've approached it in my work on my dissertation, which is about vigilantism in Indonesia, is by first sort of looking at what are the general expectations, and if the data can help confirm those expectations or problematize those expectations, beat those expectations. So with regards to vigilantism, which is the article that you were referring to, the general expectation is that vigilantism, or acts when people take the law into their own hands to punish a thief or punish somebody who's expected of doing something wrong, even moral issues such as sexual indiscretion, fornication, other those kinds of moral sins that are problematic in a society. The general expectation is that we should expect a rise in vigilantism when there is a lack of state presence on the ground, when there's not enough police doing the crime control, so people feel compelled to then punish thieves themselves. Or it can also happen during times of acute crisis. So when there's widespread communal violence, for example, or civil war going on, there's very little provision of order by the state. And so then again, people are compelled to take the law into their own hands. What I found with the NVMS data, with the data that I was collecting for the World Bank, was that the incidence of vigilantism in Indonesia was on the rise despite an increase in police presence and despite an improvement in other forms of security problems. So Indonesia had massive communal riots in 1999 to 2023. There's also civil war in Aceh. All those problems were gradually being resolved through democratic processes, but vigilantism was on the rise. There was a gradual increase in police numbers because police had been separated from the military in Indonesia. But despite the increase in police numbers and increase in presence of police in even faraway areas, what we were seeing was an increase in vigilantism. So in this sense, the data helped me find something that was surprising, that was against the expectation. So that was the way in which I used it. But the data only showed that this was the case. It didn't help me understand the why. And for that, I had to conduct very extensive fieldwork.
Right. And often, I think, as a junior scholar, when we had a method course, right, there's always this pitting between qualitative and quantitative method, right? And somehow we are supposed to kind of led to this quite simplistic debate of, well, qualitative is more subjective and quantitative is more objective, or one is better than the other, and there's this kind of dichotomy between subjective and objective representation somehow. But is that too limiting? Can data or nature of a data ever be objective?
No, data can never be objective. I don't think so. And anybody who is doing quantitative work and is insisting that the numbers are objective, I think should be taken with a grain of salt. having collected this sort of huge resource, this quantitative resource on violence, I can tell you that the process of thinking about what to collect is subjective. Which sources to use in order to construct a database is subjective. Which indicators to use to include in the data set, that's subjective. The way in which coding happens is very subjective. So the issue isn't that it's objective or subjective. The issue is how do we use the data with all of its problems of subjectivity that are there, is to acknowledge those subjectivities and use it in a way that can still lead to some helpful conclusions despite the problems that exist.
Exactly. And in your experience, did your understanding of what constitute violence evolve as you interact a little bit more, both qualitatively and in quantitative sense?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. We were coding with a team of about 40 coders. So the data set has about 180,000 incidents, which is quite a large undertaking. We were using a lot of over 100 local newspapers in order to collect this data. So we needed a very large team to be able to collect it. Now, 40 coders, if you have 40 people reading newspaper articles and coding information from them, everybody has a different understanding of what constitutes violence, what constitutes serious enough violence, and how to even classify numbers that we tend to take as a given, such as death numbers. Multiple newspapers report multiple casualty figures sometimes, especially in large incidents where information is very limited. So constructing the database involves making subjective decisions at every stage. Even figures such as death numbers that can seem definite, because there's no confusion. With numbers such as injuries, there can be some confusion about, is it a serious injury? It's a sliding scale, right? But death has a definitive quality to it. So you can think of it as an objective number, but it's not, because oftentimes when we are coding for events, there's a lot of uncertainty and dispute about the number of deaths. And so multiple newspapers, when we were coding, would in some incidents report different numbers of deaths for the same incident. So it requires a subjective process in deciding which newspaper is to be believed in this, or which newspaper has more updated information about what really happened, which information is likely to be biased in a way to reduce death numbers. And so we had to come up with, based on our knowledge of these newspapers, we had conducted interviews with the editorial boards, with the reporters before we picked them for the database. So we had some understanding of how they decide on these numbers, how they report these numbers, and how they update these numbers over time. And so that helped us make decisions that were more informed, but definitely not 100% free of error.
Definitely. And often there is this mystical quality about numbers, right? It makes it seems to be very exact, very measured, very definite, right? When people see number, they're often like, yes, that means that's a fact, that's just true. But often even number is some form of representations of reality, as you said. Number is also as good as how people collect and count them, right? And in the process of the making of the instrument, in the early process at least, was there a lot of debate about how to best represent, and did you somehow perhaps encounter, well, maybe this is not the best way, maybe we should revise this way, or how to collect our data over time? Is that your experience?
Yes, initially the instrument that we devised was very detailed. So it was a team of us working together. There were people who had, I had just arrived, but there were people who had been working on Indonesian politics and violence and conflict for a long time, who had a much better understanding than I did about what really took place. A lot of them had very strong field experience. And so initially our instruments were very detailed. We wanted to, for example, distinguish between the number of buildings that had been completely destroyed versus the number of buildings that were damaged. We wanted to sort of, cross-tab with the number of buildings that were damaged, how many of them were religious buildings, how many of them were buildings that belonged to the government, how many of them were. So we had a lot of different variables. We also wanted to gather data on non-violent conflict. So non-violent demonstrations, for example, and other sort of things that would constitute collective acts but would not be violent. what we've discovered in our pilot, usually for these large data projects, we test it out before we roll it on full scale, was that a lot of these very small distinctions would not be captured in the sources that we were using, and some of them would be biased. So, for example, from our interviews with newspaper editors, we found that they're more likely to report an act that involves physical violence compared to ones that are not, right? And so, if a demonstration was violent in some way, it is more likely to be reported compared to a small demonstration that involved 20 people that did not turn violent. So, what this would mean is we would get a systematic bias underreporting of non-violent demonstrations and systematic reporting of violent ones, which means we would not be able to use those kinds of numbers well. So we had to drop that variable from the database and focus just on violent conflict.
Yeah, and I think that example point to at least two often issues that quantitative research are grappling with, right? This discernibility, how to craft questions that people can understand, and also representation, right? How to make sure your, survey or even the pilot itself represent your larger sample, and you can work across sample. And if we focus on the first one, these issues of making sure that the questions reflect or people can understand this. When designing large N dataset survey, how did your field experiences or even cultural understanding help you ask better questions? Is that your experience as well when you were designing the data set?
So when you're designing an instrument, you're really just thinking about the kind of analysis that you want to do, and then and you have some idea of the kind of interesting questions that can come out of it. But really, the processes in the process of collecting the data can teach you certain things about the data itself. So one of the really sort of educational moments for me was when we had divided the data set into different types of violence. And one of them was vigilante violence. So we had a separate category for it because we didn't know how to fit it. And we didn't expect it to become such a large category, but it actually ended up being one of the largest categories of violence in what we call post-conflict Indonesia. The really sort of learning moment for me was when we had included this in the instrument and asked coders to code it. We started getting really strange numbers of victims for those incidents. And having a closer look, I realized that the coders were coding as victims people whose things had been stolen, people who did the violence. Because in their minds, the thief who had been killed in an act of lynching, for example, was not the victim, but was actually the perpetrator. And the victims were people whose things were stolen or who had been subjected to theft. And so that was really interesting to see, because in our mind that was not the case. The victim was the victim of the violence. And that was really a very informative moment for me, because it taught me that the way in which people view these incidents of lynching that were one of the largest findings of our database was actually based on this perception of violence. Now, of course, we worked with the coding team to talk about, that what the victim means in this case, etc. And we were able to sort of build consensus and correct it. But just the finding itself for me was quite interesting, because there was a debate amongst the coders about who is even the victim here.
That's really fascinating. This whole thing about debates among coders really highlight that role of researchers, right? And this iterative process of research, in a way, and debate on how to constitute or better represent reality. And often, especially with big country like Indonesia that has all this different variation across the region, let alone if we talk about Southeast Asia, right? If we just talk about Indonesia, that must be quite exhausting in just thinking about how to make sure you get, you reflect different, you account for all these differences across the region. What was your experience in that, especially among the coders, right? Like when you were debating about what constitutes violence, how did you resolve and reconcile at the end?
Yeah, I think so. There's a few things. One is the process, as I mentioned, the inputs that go into making the data, and the other is the findings. So in the input process, for example, we did have coders who thought that there were some news articles about attempted abortions, for example, that should be counted as violence. So we had to then come up with a coding key or a coding guideline that sort of talked about why those kinds of incidents were not included, as they correspond to people's beliefs, right? And so we had to sort of think about analytical and substantive reasons to limit the scope of the database in a way that was collective, that we were focusing on collective acts of violence, interpersonal violence, etc., and why the definition could be limited in a way that would be useful. So we're not comparing, for example, incidents of abortion aren't even reported that widely, so that would be underreported anyway, and we would not be able to classify that as something that we would study. And so we had to make those kinds of choices. The other interesting thing I thought that comes out of a large data set like this is it helps you make sense of the variation sometimes, and also think about certain notions of cultural prevalence, etc., that are built into our understanding of why violence happens. So, for example, when I was doing my fieldwork in parts of Eastern Java or other parts, there would always be a particular ethnic group that would be described as one that was so likely to lynch. And so, for example, when I was in Surabaya, the idea was, it's the Maduris who are, they have this tradition of engaging in lynching or vigilantism. When I was in Jakarta, outskirts of Jakarta, the capital city, there was always the Betawi who were, hot-headed or were described in these sort of cultural terms. In Lampung, it was the Orang Asli Lampung who were described in this way by the transmigrants, or the other way around. The transmigrants would describe the Javanese as somebody who had brought this tradition of lynching to Sumatra. So, then the data sort of showed, well, actually, it's happening everywhere. It's happening in big cities, not just rural areas. And so the sort of spread of it, the variation of it, helped engage with those kinds of ideas and say, well, that might not make so much sense, because if that were the case, you would only find it in Madura, you would only find it in Surabaya, in the Maduris community. But the fact is that we were finding it quite pervasively everywhere.
Yes, and that also tells you this different kind of data that you are interacting with, right? They look similar, but they're actually quite different, because one, the number, the survey and the statistics that you find is an empirical data that reflect this, widespread trend of violence. But when you started talking to people in their context, that reflects data about their perception, right? Their perceptions about who committed those violence, regardless of the fact, which is still quite valuable as well in a way, right? What do you think about that?
So I think it's valuable to talk to people about the numbers, especially because I was dealing with numbers that were quite sensitive, death and incidents of violence. There were some some of my interlocutors felt that counting these things reduces people to a statistic. So there is this perception, and we often do encounter that. So, in conflicts around the world, including some that are going on, for example, and the violence in Gaza, oftentimes giving statistics can give the impression that you are reducing people's lives and the tragedy of it to mere numbers. I think that's definitely a valid perspective and worth thinking about, and these numbers should be used with care. But another perspective is that by counting the numbers of people who are suffering, you're also making them count, literally making them count in some way. And I think that's also very specifically important in types of hidden violence that are not often talked about. So vigilantism is one of them. It's not, it's not a big policy issue, but it is so pervasive. Oftentimes the victims of vigilantism are quite poor, and they are usually punished for stealing things that are quite low in value. So, for example, a handful of, in the database, I have victims who have stolen a handful of chilies or used underwear or, a gas canister, for example. Who steals that? Those are people who have very limited resources, very limited means, and often end up becoming victims of collective violence that is used to punish them for committing those crimes of desperation, really. And so, my sort of view on that was that by counting these numbers, I was trying to make those deaths count in some way.
Yes. And have someone ever been upset by the questions or the survey that you conducted? Because, like you said, it could be quite sensitive, right? Some of the questions you are asking. And how do you address that kind of local sensitivities or account for or even prevent those kind of local sensitivities?
So the data on violence that we were collecting was mostly based on newspaper reports. So we weren't surveying anybody for that particular project. But since then, out of that project came out another research project that I'm doing now, which is the role of neighborhood leaders in managing local order in Indonesia, which involves surveys, which means we find certain respondents and we ask them a list of questions about their work, about their perceptions, about their role. What do they find most challenging, etc. A lot of those questions are based on my prior fieldwork. So they are informed by how do ordinary people talk about these things. Because not everybody is used to talking about their work. Not everybody is used to describing their opinions. And so when you have, opinion surveys that are quite pervasive, for example, opinion surveys that ask about satisfaction with government or political choice, etc. Those are simple questions and we can just replicate them. But in my case, because I was interviewing and surveying neighborhood leaders about their jobs, and my understanding was from having interviewed so many of them that they're not used to talking about their jobs. The survey questions had to reflect that. It had to have a strategy of giving them options that would make sense to them about how they think about their jobs. And so the fieldwork was crucial, really, in devising those questions. We always have a pilot before launching a larger study, and so that can help test out some of the questions that are not making sense or can be a little too politically sensitive as well. There's an ethics process, obviously, where we can learn about certain things that would be problematic. So it's not it's not an instant process. It requires a lot of reiteration. It requires a lot of reflection to get to the questions, and then it requires a lot of reflection to make meaning out of those numbers once you do get them.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about just constant process of reflection and iterations, right? But when we go back to these issues of representation, that's also one of the very tricky thing, because throughout history, for example, in medical or neuroscience field, there's quite a lot of this case selection bias, right? They are specifically choosing white male to represent the entire population, and somehow as a result it's underrepresenting general population that's quite diverse or female, and leading to kind of like bad results, really, right? And therefore these issues of representation become quite important. How did you experience that kind of, especially in a very varied case or region like Indonesia or Southeast Asia? It's quite diverse. How do you make sure that you represent your sample well?
So there's some, science behind the design of surveys that can help us get a broad sample and a representative one. But a lot of the times it suffers from particular types of biases. So in surveys, for example, this is a known fact among people who conduct surveys, that people who belong to a very high income bracket are less likely to agree to be surveyed compared to people who belong to sort of lower rings of economic income or of income. And so when we are and there's not that much you can do actually to change that, unless you want to sort of spend a lot of your grant budget on oversampling certain populations. That can help, but that's a very expensive option. But what you can do is try to analyze results with that deficiency in mind. Is this finding being generated by the fact that I have a lower representation of this particular income group who is more likely to be at home to be surveyed, right? who's more likely to agree to be surveyed. So there are some technical things that I've done. So, for example, tracking how many respondents have refused and where. So if you're getting a particularly systematic refusal to interview from particular kinds of respondents, then you know that there's a problem in the survey, and that should be addressed at least at the analysis stage. There's also then post-survey analysis type things that you can do to try to mitigate the impact of that problem. But as I said, all data is incomplete. All data has deficiencies. I think the best way to address it is by acknowledging those deficiencies and trying to find ways, like a lawyer, to decide which evidence is best used to demonstrate which part of your argument most strongly, and which part of the argument needs to be supported by different types of evidence, for example, fieldwork or interviews. So I think that's where the fieldwork is very important, because it can inform not just the way in which you think about which questions to ask, but also inform the way in which you should ask them. So it's simple things. For example, in one of my recent surveys, I had this question to the neighborhood leaders in Indonesia about which aspect of their jobs do they find most important? Do they think is they most likely to prioritize? Now, that's a simple question, but what options do you give them? Right? So ideally for a survey, what we would want is pre-formed options so that respondents can pick one. If you have an open-ended answer, then people might give you very long answers and very different answers, which would make it very difficult for you to then make sense of them. Right? And so based on my fieldwork, I was able to identify 4 types or 4 aspects of the job that I'd heard across Indonesia neighborhood leaders mention or describe or discuss, that sort of reflected the broader context without compromising the ability of researchers to then analyze the answers to those questions. And so in that sense, it's an iterative process, and it ended up being useful.
And going to just some last questions, a couple actually. The first one is more about this. What is considered valid? How do you validate your data?
So I think there's multiple stages at which you can check the usefulness of your data and the way in which it is valid. I, for once, don't like to use the word valid, because valid is very dependent on the kind of question that you're asking. So data might be valid for answering one question, but it might not be so valid for answering another type of question. So, for example, some people were worried about violence in the context of Papua, and using newspaper data or social media data to gather information about the incidence of violence in Papua during the race riots in 2019. The issue then is, if you use those sources, there's an internet shutdown, which means those sources will not be very valid for collecting data in a situation where the government has imposed an internet ban and information is being restricted, right? So you have to sort of think about the validity of the data generation process. You have to think about the validity and the usefulness of it in the particular question that you're asking, and the way in which you generate numbers and figures and relationship between data points as well. So the kind of tools that you use to make connections between one type of data and another type of data. For example, where is violence happening more? Is it happening more in areas that have a police post versus areas that don't have a police post? Right? How do you make that sort of connection? So there are different ways of analyzing the data. We have some technical tools that can help with validating. But then also, the academic process, the scholarly process, involves peer review, which means it goes to our colleagues and peers who are also knowledgeable in these topics, and they have a look at it, and they also help us sort of think about whether the use of this data is helpful, informative, valid, and so there's no perfect answer to any question, but we can try to look for better answers, and the goal is really to always look for better answers than we have, rather than the right, the correct, the absolute truth. right? So we are engaging in an exercise which is trying to get us closer to a better answer compared to just a perfect or 100% correct answer.
And I
don't
think
we're
that
there.
that's a really good point, Sana. And often scholars forget that, and they demand, you get this perfect answer, but often research objective is not always clear cut and result in quite narrow, right? When you want authenticity, it often you get you are compromising on the measurability or applicability of that experience, right?
So, in my view, there are two trends at the moment, or have been for a while. One is that looking for precision in an answer, right? So, how precisely can you measure the connection between A and B, between an input and an output, between an outcome and the cause of it, right? So, how precisely you can measure it. The thing is, if you ask a very broad question, it's very difficult to measure the answer very precisely, right? Then the debate is between asking smaller questions, very more precise questions that can then lead us to come up with very precise answers with data. So randomized controlled trials, for example, are one of those types of analysis that scholars do, but they have very limited what we call external validity, in the sense that experiments give you a very precise connection between two variables, but they don't necessarily apply to contexts outside of that experiment, right? So that's one. The other is you can try different other types of data analysis methods with quantitative data combined with qualitative data. Those will give you less precise answers, but they might have a broader scope because they have consulted a broader number of people. And so it's a trade-off more than combination or a midway or something like that. You can adjust your instruments to that. What are the different competing explanations? What are the indicators that need to be paid attention to? How do even people perceive the data that you are putting out? And so it's entirely informed for me by fieldwork, but also data generation itself then informs my fieldwork. So then I know if the quantitative data is showing particular kinds of connections, as I mentioned for my dissertation, is showing that more and more vigilantism is happening in areas where there's more and more police, right? And so when I go to the field, then again to try to understand why, then I know that that's the particular connection that I want to explore, is the relationship between vigilantism and police presence in communities. So it works both ways. It works in circles, and for me, that's the best part of being a researcher. Is to be able to sort of circle back to the quantitative data and the qualitative data to try to understand things that are otherwise, for me, very difficult to get a handle on.
Well, that's really helpful. Thank you very much, Sana.
Thank
And
you.
this is Southeast Asia from the ground up. Thank you.
Thank you.